Hello, 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 everyone. It's a rainy day where I am. I hope everyone is safe and sound wherever they are. Welcome to another installment of Open Air presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm Dexter Wimberly, and we have an exciting guest today. Chelsea Odufu is a first-generation Nigerian and Guyanese American filmmaker and multidisciplinary artist working across narrative, experimental film, video art, installation, and photography. Odofu is deeply concerned with how traditional aspects of Black culture are preserved in the face of urbanization and globalization. Her work is influenced by the hybridity of her ethnic identity, speaking to American, African, and Caribbean histories and aesthetics. Her work also examines how culture, religion, and geographic location influence how ethnic identities are formed and evolve. Chelsea's work incorporates the mystic, allowing time to collapse in her work where the future, past, and present coincide in her pieces. Chelsea's work juxtaposes Afrofuturistic imagery, archival footage, and poetic approaches to demystify the stigmas typically connected to BIPOC identities. Her work is visually striking, emotional, and thought provoking, yet it's clear her process comes from a very intuitive place. Chelsea is also one of the artists in Becoming the Sea, the current exhibition at the Harvey B. Gantt Center, highlighting 12 creatives who participate in the first 2 years of the Black Rock Senegal residency in Dakar. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chelsea Odofu to today's conversation. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm great. How are you?
I'm great as well. It's great having you here. Hopefully, my sound is coming in loud and clear. As I mentioned, it's very rainy and stormy where I am, so I hope wherever you are is dry and safe.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's pretty. It's not too bad. I was actually just where you were in Japan, and it was pretty rainy out there. So it's nice to be back in New York a little bit for a short amount of time before I chase the sun again and go back to Cote d'Ivoire.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I just read your bio, so obviously that gave us a lot of like background information, but I'd love to hear directly from you. Like, could you talk a little bit about like how do you introduce yourself? How do you introduce your work? And, as an artist, you're moving about and people are always asking you, I'm sure, like, what do you do? That question that artists get all the time. Like, how do you answer that? How do you describe what you do?
Um, I mean, I think when I think about myself as an artist, I think art is just a representation of the healing journey that I'm on as an individual. And that, the journey I'm on is kind of this journey of exploration, me understanding a deeper like aspect of myself that I think only going on this journey of exploration, going to different cultures and seeing different things kind of really allows me to get to know myself. So, as a Guyanese Nigerian American growing up in, North New Jersey, oftentimes I grew up with this kind of not confused about my identity because obviously I knew who I was, but I think it took a while for me to kind of really appreciate all the multidimensionalities of my identity, and being able to be proud to say like, oh, I'm African or I'm Caribbean, amongst kind of, a landscape that kind of just wants to put you in a box of just like you're black. Which I, obviously proud to be black, but wanting to be able to, honor my heritage and my ancestral heritage in a deeper way that reflected, who I was in a vast perspective. So I think when I think about my process as an artist, it's really about, my journey is about kind of getting to know myself better, right? How do I destigmatize the ideas that I had about my own identity to be able to make it something that is real by placing myself, right, whether or not it's spending time in Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, and understanding how the history of the gold trade played into my diasporic identity, or going to India and understanding like, oh, I'm as a Guyanese, like Indian culture came to the Caribbeans via indentured servitude, and that's why I'm wearing saris going to weddings. I think me traveling and pursuing art is kind of just a reflection of this where I am in my own kind of healing journey of getting to know who I am better, and on a much deeper level.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and it kind of connects to the first question I have for you, which is like, like your work navigates the intersection of all of these different identities, and like I wanted to hear more about how your personal experience as a first generation Nigerian and Guyanese American shapes your artistic practice. I mean, how did you like when you decided to go on this journey as an artist? Obviously, you had to make some decisions about whether or not your work was going to reflect all of these different aspects of your life, or maybe, or one dimension. Can you talk a little bit about how you sort of work through that? Because it's complicated, right? I wouldn't say representing, but when your work is reflecting all of these different cultures, I'm sure you get a lot of questions about that. Like, are you appropriating something? Oh, I didn't know that you were connected to this culture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, for sure. I mean, I think starting out as a filmmaker on a more narrative front, I think, I would want to weave characters into my stories that kind of bring in that first generation experience. And I think was the first level of kind of what that perspective was of like, I 100% understand that in the eyes of my Caribbean and African family, like they see me as American, and it's not something that I stray from that American experience is something that I was raised in, and I'm appreciative of my connection to it. But I think, it took me some time to be able to actually travel to some of these places to almost kind of ground myself in authenticity, right? Because I didn't want it to come up that like, oh, you grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Are you really Nigerian? Are you really Guyanese? Do you really understand this experience, right? So I had to, even though people might have been saying that in the background, nobody ever said it to my face, of course, but like regardless, it was this kind of internal, journey that I felt like I needed to spend more time going out into the world myself, right? That I had to destigmatize some of these experiences that were placed on me that I might have believed at one point, just because the way that, right, society kind of indoctrinates you into believing certain things about certain cultures, that I had to kind of go out into the world and connect to it. So I think travel has just always been something that, has just been part of. It's like another language of expression for me. And I think all of the travels that I do always kind of inform some aspect of, just of my identity. And there are times where, for example, when I'm spending time in Senegal and I'm not Senegalese, I'm not Islamic, but I think there's a lot of values in regards to kind of seeing these parallels or seeing these things that are very much connected, right? Like when I was doing research on spirituality in Senegal, it reminded me sometimes of stories that I grew up hearing my mom talk about, right? Of like, things of the land in the Amazon, or things that I'm like, I wonder if this crossed over the Atlantic Ocean, that like this seems familiar, right? This story seems familiar in some way, or like drinking B-sap. And I'm like, oh, this is sorrow, like there's so many like small things in the nuances of travel that kind of widen out the way that my identity that felt at some points so limited actually connected to all these other identities. So I think that's when I'm traveling, it's kind of like me putting pieces of history together and how my identity specifically, although it's in this present time of 2024, right? How does it connect to this larger tree of branches that stem from all these different histories that kind of make me who I am today?
Yeah, I love the fact that travel influences your work so much. I mean, for me, I yeah, I was born and raised in the U.S., but for me, it's like I feel most American outside of America, right? It's just
Absolutely.
like, and I say that because I think that the experience of travel really changes your perspective on things, and you see yourself. Not everyone, but I think oftentimes you see yourself differently, and then when you bring back those experiences to wherever home is, I think you're able to navigate things with a slightly more nuanced, like flavor of understanding that you're not the center of the world, so to speak. Like that's kind of like a big part of it. It decentralizes you in a good way. But let's talk a little bit more about filmmaking. I don't often get to talk to filmmakers. I mean, most of the people that I've interviewed in this series have been, painters or sculptors or performance artists, all in the visual arts, of course, but not many filmmakers. And then you are fascinating because you're not only doing what one would call fine art, but you're also working in the commercial space. Can you talk a little bit about balancing fine art and also your commercial career, for lack of a better terminology?
No, for sure. I mean, it's interesting because they definitely feel like different universes, and there's definitely different perceptions of even having my sculpture at Burning Man, to some fine art people they're like, oh, what are we doing out there, and vice versa, right? When I'm talking to burners about some of these fine art things, they're like, okay, that's cool. So right, it's completely different universes that I'm in, but I also realized that film has been something that I've always done, and that there's an aspect of my journey that will be commercial, and that how can I bring this different perspective to both arenas, right? Like, how can I, with the skills that I've had developed as a filmmaker and as a narrative filmmaker, building out this universe and aesthetic in my work, I think I see myself. I think that the balance is kind of the fact that I found my voice, right? That all of my work lives within this specific universe that is being pulled and inspired from. So even if I'm shifting from commercial or shifting from fine art, I think I'm still carrying the same sensibility of like how I navigate through the world and how I choose to express myself. Or whether or not that's like I started doing some sculptural work, right? And like that sculptural work also kind of lends itself into just this kind of balance of me living within this kind of Afrofuturistic universe, this kind of sci-fi magical realism universe that's kind of blending all these different, experiences that I had and histories that that I've researched and learned about. So I think it is a balance, but I'm actually excited about it. I think I'm hoping that I can bring more intellectual value to the commercial space, right? And also, kind of push sometimes boundaries in regards to how we experience video, how we experience, the traditional forms of work that we see within the fine art space. Like, how can I also kind of push that forward with for the perspective that I'm bringing? So, yeah, it's a balance. It's a lot of shape shifting, my mindset sometimes, but luckily, like I said, it's all within this kind of strong voice and universe that I've made that I don't oftentimes feel lost at all.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I entered the art world from the commercial world unconsciously many, many years ago, and I think I brought a lot of like practices and ways of doing things from my commercial background. I was in advertising before I was a curator, that I think if I hadn't been on that journey, my way of doing things would be very, very different. And I love the fact that you're like exercising these different muscles, right? Because it's very different to say, hey, I have this idea for a sculpture, and I know that you also sculpt. Like, I have this idea for a sculpture, but no one's got me on a deadline. I can finish it whenever I feel like it's finished. That's very different than a client giving you a budget and a timeline and saying, hey, we need this in 30 days, right? Like that. It's a very, very different situation. And also working collaboratively with other people. I mean, I'm sure for your commercial work, the teams you're working with, there's lighting and there's makeup and there's hair and all these things. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I have more questions to ask you, but I can't help but ask this. I mean, for as much as you can share, you were recently in Japan working on a commercial project. You don't have to divulge the client per se, but I'm just kind of curious to hear about that. I mean, that's a fantastic adventure.
Absolutely. So yeah, I was working on a commercial for a really cool client that's looking to kind of get insider experiences about Japan, and kind of thought that my my sensibility as a traveler and how I kind of navigate through spaces with a, I think, a really empathetic lens and a kind of open-minded and open-hearted lens, I think, allows me to kind of navigate through very different experiences. But it was great. I mean, I think it's sad, the last day of wrap on a large production. It was a predominantly Japanese crew, but it had a few people who had moved to Japan, and or like Japanese but went to school in California, or like one of our producers was like was born in Brazil but was Japanese. So it kind of also had, right, this kind of cultural perspective on the set, which was also really interesting. But it's kind of bittersweet when you leave these productions, because one, you realize that you're connecting with people who have a different kind of way of life and a different frequency, but you're all connecting on creativity, which is one of the most beautiful aspects of it. But also, right, they're so far away that there's an aspect of it that you might not be able to see them again. So I think Japan, I think the whole entire experience, Japan is so different from America, right? It's a lot about mindfulness, a lot about patience, a lot about stillness. You know, uh, the way that you communicate and bow to people and respect them, even in the, just casual exchanges, I think really leave you with a sense of mindfulness when you come back home. And I was able to experience a Goma fire ceremony with monks. I had a day kind of just spending really intimate time with monks, and at a temple in Kyoto, I got some time to intimate time with some sumos and some lots of different kind of entry points into Japanese culture. And I think one of the things that really resonated with me about Japan is that they have these ancient traditions that still really shape the way that society runs. And it makes me reflect on how sometimes within our own culture there's so many things about ancient traditions that are so highly stigmatized, and that when we think about, like, I was at the Katsuro Matsuri festival in Kyoto, right? It's like 1,000-year-old festival that you know the processions, the way that the prayers, all these things have been for thousands of years, but it's something that the culture is able to proudly connect to. And I think that that's kind of, when I think about my work and I think about when I'm traveling and the things that I'm pulling from, it's kind of this desire to destigmatize my own experience, my own spirituality, my own, the way that I connect to my own culture, and the ways that I see other societies, right, being able to still proudly engage with their spirituality of Shintoism or Zen Buddhism, in ways that sometimes people of color don't really have that space. So I think it's many things. I think travel kind of has like many downloads. It's like connecting with amazing people that you realize that like come from a complete different way of life, and a different approach to things, of finding ways, like the beauty is in the collaboration. Then there's, right, having these moments where you're able to kind of look at one's culture and look at your culture and kind of you know not put them in comparison, but just kind of see the similarities and the differences of it, which I think often lends. And then it's the kind of personal mindfulness that you have when you leave a space that really makes you reflect on what that experience is. So I'm still reflecting on my time at the Goma fire ceremony with the monks, and I'm like, I'm like processing. I'm like, wow, like, did I get healed from that? Like there's something about that experience that I'm like, that I'm craving to go back and almost like put myself back in that experience, because of how much reflections I've had on the back end of it. So I think it just opens me up, to new community, but also like really just like elevating my kind of consciousness and openness to different experiences and different cultures.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about time. You mentioned time a few times, and I know that in your work, you also, one of the things I read in your bio is sort of your work collapses time, sort of merging the past, present, and future. Can you talk a little bit about like what that means to you?
For sure. I mean, I think as someone who incorporates Afrofuturism into my work, I think one of the foundations of Afrofuturism is about thinking about time in a circular way and not in a linear way, right? So obviously, we can always think about the past and moving forward, but it's kind of me thinking about the past, the present, and the future in this way that kind of comes around in a circle, right? All of these things are influencing, the next step, the first step, the past step, in the work that I make. So I think when I think about time, I also think about dimensions. I'm also thinking about, how multiple things can be happening at the same time, right? Like how if I'm in Cote d'Ivoire and I'm in a space like the first colonial capital of Bassam, which is where I've been doing a lot of my research on the series Gold with a Mind of Its Own. I can be thinking about, I'm living a future experience, I'm living a present experience, but I'm also thinking about the colonial history around me, right? With these abandoned buildings that still represent the colonial history. But then I'm also thinking about the multiple dimensions of the people that lost their lives in this space, right? And like the energy, right? This like energy of time that has transcended time, that's in the same space as I am in this current moment. So I think I'm thinking about all these things, and then I'm obviously thinking about, what that looks like for the future, right? And how I ultimately kind of put these two things together, right? From entities that are navigating through time, the colonial history that's geographically around me embodying it in a present day, perspective, and then me taking all of this information and putting it together to kind of reflect this universe, right? This universe that is, somewhere that's just like somewhere, right? Like it's like, nah, I can't really say what the universe is. Like sometimes I like to say it's a reflection of the Andromeda galaxy, which is the closest galaxy from the Milky Way. But it kind of just like lives in this other, ecosystem. And then that's kind of what my output is. So yeah, I think I'm just thinking about lots of things, right? The history of places, my current experience, but then because my work's about spirituality, I'm thinking about the other dimensions of things that are kind of just flowing through many of times, that kind of creates this kind of circular rhythm for me in my work.
Thank you. Thank you. So you use a lot of archival footage and poetic visual language, like in your work. Like, where do you draw these archives? Where are you getting these resources from? Like, what are your sort of sources? So you go in the libraries, you looking online, or do you kind of collect old publications? Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
No, I'm honestly going to like, the free libraries online for public domain work. I know it sounds, maybe not as exciting as, me going to traveling. It's something I want to do, is kind of being able to travel and get more access to being able to look at, other countries' archives. But right now, honestly, I've just been using the public domain archive. I think it's unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot of representation of Black history and like the elements that, typically it'd be great to find, but it is a lot about wheezing through. And oftentimes when I'm thinking about it, I don't really have a purpose specifically of how I'm going to use it at the time, right? A lot of times it's just like an emotion or an energy that would be perfect for a kind of a comparison. Oftentimes when I'm using archival footage, I'm always kind of combining it with, in like a two-channel form with like a modern visual. So oftentimes when I'm pulling archival footage, it's thinking about, I'm looking for dance, or it could just about looking for Black people that are happy, and it could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly me taking the archival footage and utilizing it in its initial purpose. Oftentimes it's me kind of pulling it and repurposing it in a complete different way and having a different life about it. So um, that's how I've been using archival footage in my work. And I think it just, to me, thinking about timelines, right? It's like, how do I constantly create these different timelines to showcase the parallels in our experiences, right? Like the experience of the 80s might be an experience of the 2000s, might be an experience of the 2020s, right? Like how do all these timelines that are happening at the same time, or in different times, still kind of reflect the same experience? So that's how I kind of utilize archival footage in my work.
Well, we have some images of your work, and also a video at the end as well. Let's get that prompted. And in the meantime, oh, look, right away. That's fantastic. I was going to say, in the meantime, I have another question, but I'll save that question. So we have a few images of your work, and what I'd love for you to do is maybe take a moment or two to just describe what you'd like to share about each image. So let's start here.
Yeah. So this work right here is from my latest series, Go with a Mind of Its Own, that I've been shooting in Cote d'Ivoire for the past like year and a half, almost 2 years. And when I first got to Cote d'Ivoire, I was, thinking about, what am I going to write about? What am I going to, explore in my this new series of work? And first I landed on just kind of being, really inspired by the Khan Empire. And, if anyone knows the Khan Empire between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they're really known for their gold, and they're kind of very luxurious and, just kind of magnificent and grandeur way of kind of showcasing the royalty depicted around them. So it was something that I really wanted to explore. Not only was it kind of a reverence to, right, this Akan Empire, but then I think as I continued to do research on the Akan Empire, I realized obviously, the involvement of the gold trade and how the gold trade kind of opened up the door to my identity as an African diasporic person, right? A lot of people, a lot of us in the diaspora are, as a result of the gold trade, and colonization, the history of colonization, how the gold trade influenced that. So the narrative started to expand from me just kind of looking at the Khan Empire as this obviously very symbol of African empires and African royalty, which is something that we still look up to, even though the history could be a little complicated. But then looking at the gold trade, and kind of thinking about the spirit of the gold, and what did gold mean to the Gold Coast or the Khan people before kind of capitalism came in the mix, and who were some of the beings, right, that the people who were ultimately lost at the hands of the gold trade. And I think it's so interesting right now. If people are seeing on social media, there's a lot of attention in Ghana, for example, right now, or there's like, a lot of people come to Ghana for the end of December, but this should be attention on, right, the legal gold mining that's happening and the poisoning of the rivers that's happening in Ghana for a lot of gold mining. That, it's interesting, obviously, this land of gold and the Gold Coast. So we can go to the next slide. I think the
Sure.
next image is
Sure. Let's advance to the next image. It's part of the same series.
it's
Yes.
part of the series, exactly. But thinking about, right, like when I think about the Khan Empire, who is obviously living on gold and just endless gold flowing down the rivers, and you hear these stories about how much gold everyone just had, and they were just dripping in gold, right? That you realize that now these people don't own any of their mining, right? But there's this kind of new form of capitalism that still has people desire for the wealth of gold, right? So we have young guys, right, who have bought into the American dream or this desire for capitalism, who ultimately are now having to work in these gold mines, although they are not making any money, although it's part of their legacy and land that they ultimately have for themselves. So it's interesting of me thinking about kind of taking this series from different perspectives, like the root of it, of being like, I'm inspired by the Khan Empire, and it as a symbol of regality and a powerful empire, in the same way other cultures are proud of the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire. But then it's like all empires have this desire for expansion, and the desire for expansion introduced the gold trade to West Africa. So this series is kind of thinking about all these things, thinking about, again, the people who were, products or victims of the gold trade, right? Whether or not they were, sold into slavery, whether or not they are pursuing this modern day life of aspirations of finding a gold nugget that would change their life and make them rich. We realize that the gold trade, even in 2024, is still something that is affecting the lives of their experiences of people of color around the world. So this kind of full circle narrative, I think, is part of what this series is about for me.
Fantastic. Let's go to the next image.
This image, I mean, just to add a note about this, I mean, I think when I was thinking about like why, if I was living on a whole bunch of gold, what would I absolutely need anybody for? I'm living on a whole bunch of wealth, and I think when I was doing a lot of research, I was realizing that the introduction of machinery and ammunition, right, was one of those things that ultimately really kind of stirred the pot, and kind of again, this desire for expansion. If you guys have guns and ammunition right now, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to expand our desire for to be more wealthy and to have a larger empire. So it's kind of like the research has made me, on one hand, right, it's sad because you realize, right, obviously our experiences as African diasporic people are very much so connected to this, but then I also, on the other hand, have to see it in the same way that, right, just like empires, right, and their desire to expand their nations, and what did that mentality look like at that time, although I'm obviously considering the effects of and the legacy of what that is as well now. So I think you know ammunition was a really big role in regards to the slave trade and how that ultimately propelled tribalism, tribal warfare, and all these things within the region at that time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I have some questions. I'm going to wait until we're done with the images and video to come back to those. So let's advance to the next image.
So this piece I made was actually one of my first it was my first time saying, like, I mean, not that's my first, but I mean, I've already made video installations, but it was my first time, I think, really wanting to think about the history of material and how that kind
Mm,
of lends itself to another layer of storytelling, right? So as a filmmaker, I'm already thinking about the narrative and the story, but then when I'm thinking about, as a filmmaker, putting my work within the fine art world, it's all about the material and the objects, and these additional things that communicate stuff about the history. So being in Cote d'Ivoire, the lost wax technique is something that a lot of Akan people, have been able to preserve over, decades or even centuries. And, one thing I was learning about the gold trade was that they would make these brass, figurines, of different animals that, they might not be able to communicate the same language when they were trading, but it'd be like, okay, I have this lion, right? And this lion represents wisdom. Or like, I have this,
mm,
leopard, a leopard that, gets caught in the rain, never loses its spots. So they would create these brass figurines to ultimately, right, weigh the gold and also be able to share a little bit about themselves and their history to the people that they were trading with. So I wanted to create something that, kind of represented, again, this kind of like a Khan totem, right? Like this symbol of the Khan Empire that, the bottom shape of it represents like an elongated golden stool, which is like,
no,
if anyone knows, something about the Khan Empire, right? The Golden Stool was one of those things in the stories of, like, Yah Santaway, and how they defeated the British by, holding on and being able to protect this Golden Stool that they believe just appeared to them, magically in the forest. So it's something that all the kings, within the Khan Empire all have this stool. It's a central part of the culture. And then the top part of it is me wanting to kind of give reverence to the crown of the Khan Empire, and all the detailings of it are from Adinkra symbols. So Adinkra symbols obviously are West African symbols, specifically from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, that again also tell these specific philosophies. So I wanted it to be this kind of piece of work that had many layers of coding, right? That, like, right, cool. If you know the reference of the golden stool, you're able to understand that's the shape that's on the bottom. That's the foundation. What this piece is. The top is the crown, right? All of the kufis that you see that are royal will all have these, this embellishment on the top that have these animal symbolisms. These animals that again speak philosophy, right? So yeah, I think it's just this kind of culmination of wanting to have a piece of work that um, is layered in its messaging, right? Some people will come to
right.
the piece just be able to understand the film, and then there's other people that will be able to come to the piece and understand the symbols. Then there's some people who come to the piece and I'll understand, like, oh, that's Sankofa bird on the top. This is what this means. Or
Right.
so I think it's just like it's cool to me to kind of make work that has coded elements to it that not everyone is going to be able to get in. And when they do get it, it's like, okay, you're completely on this frequency that I'm on. And if you don't, hopefully to, challenge you, or, to take a look at it, or be something that you now recognize in the future. But yeah, I wanted to make work that is starting to think about how the history of the own material kind of adds to the history of what I'm talking about in my work.
Yeah, I love how your work is connecting all of these different, one could say, mythologies, but also beliefs and religions and cultures and spirituality, and sort of bringing it all into sort of the way that you're interpreting it. Also, just from a purely, aesthetic standpoint, I mean, the work is striking and beautiful, right? So there's also that kind of brings you in, and then you can start unpacking all of these other different aspects of the work. Let's go to the next image. So I think I know where this is, but can you tell a little bit about the backstory of like what led you to even participate in Burning Man?
Yeah, I mean, I am a burner. So before before actually bringing art to the festival, I had attended Burning Man once last year, and it's interesting. Obviously, Burning Man isn't a place that has a lot of people of color, if I'm being frank. But I think when I'm at Burning Man, I'm not. I actually don't. I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about, like, this me being this kind of celestial being that is navigating through this alternate reality, versus kind of me as a person of color or anything. I'm just kind of a celestial being within this space, and I think it allows you to kind of navigate on that frequency. So it's such an inspiring place for an Afrofuturistic girl, or a girl who's, interested in alternate realities and sci-fi and the cosmos, and, but also wanting to kind of still have a point for people of color to be able to feel that they can gather and see themselves represented even within this alternate future world, right? This was like interesting. I think it's like a physical reality of, it's like a physical experience of the universe, right, that I already create within, but now I'm able to, for a week, kind of actually live with it in real time, right? I'm riding my bike in this physical reality. I'm navigating as if I'm in this reality that I normally just kind of imagine in my mind, but now it's a week of where I'm actually there. And I'm like, right, from the dust storms that are like, we installed this in like, whiteouts, right? Like 35 mile per hour, like dust storms in the west, in the desert. And like, it's cold at nighttime, it's freezing at nighttime, or it's hot. Like, I think all of these things, right, from the regular climate to just the entire ecosystem of there, I think really gives you just a physical understanding of like, what does this universe look like? So anyway, I left Burning Man really inspired my first time going there, and decided to apply for a grant to bring some work out there. And it was like the final moments, I think, of the application being open, which is, always like, sometimes just shoot your shot, no matter if it's the final moments, I think is the point for me here. But I was like, what do I want to make this work about? And I was thinking about two things. I was thinking about one of my films that I made called Black Lady Goddess, which is set in the year 2040, when the world's found out that God is a Black woman, and she's issued reparations to all aboriginators, and Black Lady Goddess is from the series Beastar. So I was thinking about this symbol of Black Lady Goddess and this throne, and like, who has access to power, who has access to, exclusive places, or just like who's traditionally in these places of power, and how can we kind of disrupt that in a space like Burning Man, right, that has its, stereotypes of being like, oh, the Elon Musk and the Chris Rocks, and like, right, like has this kind of stigma. Like, how do I disrupt this by bringing this throne and making this accessible to other people? But then I was obviously also thinking about the work that I've been doing in Cote d'Ivoire, and like, but the Akan Empire, and thinking about, again, the regality of the Akan Empire, and oftentimes we think about traditional African experiences as being something of the past, but not really thinking about how the vision or the ideas around that were probably super innovative and super thinking about the future. So this piece of work is like a combination of like two ideas, right? Like me being inspired by past work, and which is just something that I believe in, wanting to make spaces more inclusive, and, being able to imagine people of color in these kind of divine, spaces, but also thinking about obviously this kind of ancestral, heritage that I wanted to also bring to the sculpture, right? So it also has a lot of Adinkra symbols on it, around the sculpture. And my decision to make it gold, it was a moment where it was like my team who was like, I think it looked really good mixed metal, Chelsea. And I was like, that's great. But so then I asked all the Black people that I knew, I was like, what do you think the color should be? And it's like, it got to be gold. And I was like, it became where in that conversation of asking certain people, I realized that there's certain cultural associations that different cultures have to gold, right? So some of my team members weren't not people of color, and they didn't really understand the historical like importance of having it be gold. And as soon as all of my friends were like, it has to be gold completely, I think I'm like, I was even asking ChatGPT, it's like, are there different cultural connections to, silver versus gold, or just the way that, so I think, and it was one of the only gold sculptures out in the playa, and I think it was interesting. So I think it's beautiful for me, kind of seeing the work in this space, and kind of going back to your initial question about commercial versus fine art. I think it was cool to see people engaging with work that was like a lot more intimate, right? It wasn't just like, oh, I can go around and like I want to sit on it, but like I could just drink my wine and watch it. It was like it was people who were really taking the time to really like bask themselves in the art, and connect with it. And like, and I would get messages of people who said like, we stumbled across this in the middle of the night and like just sat here and like, for an hour just kind of like meditating or having deep conversations, or whatever it was. I think that those moments actually made me feel really cool about it, right? To think that public art, is something that I really want to, have as part of my work, kind of making art accessible to all types of people. And, and I think that's just like the empowerment, my desire to empower people with the work, I think was beautiful to see. It wasn't it was like intellectual still, but it also I saw the way that people were moved by being able to like sit on it, and like, you know, people who are like, I rode across the playa, which is far. The playa can be like a New York City. Like I rode across New York City to get to your sculpture, and like
Wow.
that makes me feel good, you know. Yeah, and I think just the process, I think just of making of making the work and installing the work and Burning Man with the crazy weather storms was just like epic. It was like, you know, if there were no storms, I don't know if it would be Burning Man, you know, like if
Yeah,
I didn't
yeah, that's like part of the process, right?
it's part of the process, that I think kind of makes you realize that we're all human, and kind of really grounds and humbles you, you know. So, so yeah, it was a great opportunity, and I'm hoping that the work can travel and not necessarily only be within this festival space, but also still be able to live within, you know, the solo show that I have in the future, right? That has this as a centerpiece, as well as my other video installations and my photography work, and me kind of just thinking about this full kind of universe of work that I'm
Hmm.
creating that isn't just photo and video, but that has these different elements to it that are all again part of just my universe and an extension, or, you know, a branch from one thing to
Hmm.
the next.
Let's advance to the next image. So after Burning Man, that work ended up back in your studio or back in storage or in your possession.
Yeah, I mean, it just showed actually. Had a this weekend in Venice Beach, California. So it's doing its ways. It's there's a couple of interests of it being in a museum soon. So I'm hoping that it'll be able to kind of shape shift from the festival crowd to a more artistic crowd, or just a different space, right? To kind of, you know, everything's about strategy and how I kind of move. So it's like, all right, cool, you did Burning Man, that's great, but like, how can we kind of balance out the way that it's navigating so that it, you know, it still makes its due diligence and routes in the right perception for people. So so yeah.
Great, great. So we're looking at an installation image in the Harvey B. Gantt Center, part of the current exhibition, Becoming the Sea. So your work is in the center there. We have another image, I believe, that also shows a different perspective. But let's talk a little bit about the work that you have on view at the Gantt Center. I'll leave it up to you to share what you like. Maybe we advance to the next image because I believe that's a different perspective of this work. Correct. Okay, so we can stay here for a moment.
Yeah. um so this work is something that I made during kind of a smaller residency. I'd already done Black Rock, Senegal, and they had invited me to create some work in partnership with the U.S. Embassy, thinking about kind of sustainability within Senegal. And for me, I was thinking about many things. I was, you know, Senegal's such a spiritual place that um, it's hard to not think about the stories that people tell you about, you know, about things, right? Whether or not it's like, you know, this construction couldn't be done because we couldn't cut down that baobab tree until the marabou came and like prayed on top of it, right? So you hear these, you know, these certain nuances of stories that kind of, I think, make Senegal and the kind of layers of Senegalese spirituality really present, although it's still 99 or 95% Islamic country. So I came up with this concept for Beloved Baobab. I was doing research on, you know, the history of baobabs in Senegal, or just in yeah, specifically in Senegal. And obviously baobabs are kind of an image or a symbol of Africa to a certain degree. But, you know, I wanted to kind of dive in a little bit deeper in my research there. And I realized that, you know, baobabs were at some point in society were like the centerpieces of town, right? It's like where town hall meetings were had. You know, it's where the, you know, the king would come out and sometimes address, you know, the community. Sometimes babies were born in front of baobabs. Lots of things were happening. Griots would send messages in front of the baobab tree. And because of this, right, in Senegal for a long time, you know, griots within the culture, who are these kind of uh, you know, they're holders of history, kind of, and also oracles almost, right, that like preserve history, and also through the way that they kind of speak poetry and kind of storytell, are able to kind of showcase that history. That in Senegal, a lot of griots, they wouldn't want to bury them. They would kind of want to have them, you know, in some way. They wouldn't want the knowledge to be buried. So they would kind of have
Hmm.
them some kind of stored within this baobab tree, right? That was this, you know, trees that lived for 700 to 1,000 years, one of the trees that had the longest lifespan. So I wanted to create this piece that was kind of thinking about urbanization, and how, you know, Dakar is such a big city, and everyone's with this desire for capitalism. We desire to move from this baobab tree, right? We desire to move from the village, right, into the city. We desire for all these things, but we oftentimes leave a lot behind in that message, right? We oftentimes assimilation happens when urbanization happens. We have to now leave our traditional ecosystems and way of life into this kind of new ecosystem of the city, and oftentimes that means that there's a lot of things at stake. And part of that series is me thinking about this kind of mindfulness. I think that is being lost due to urbanization. Now, when we think about African
Mm.
spirituality, it's not only about a lot of ancient, or not even only African spirituality, because again, if we think about Shintoism in Japan, or a lot of these other indigenous or just indigenous ancient spiritualities, it all had this reverence to nature, this kind of this pursuit of being in oneness with the earth and the environment. So this piece of work was me thinking about what's at stake, right? That as we as people desire to move towards a more urban landscape, or a more capitalistic landscape, or whatever that metaphor is equivalent to in your own reality, like what are we also losing? Are we becoming more disconnected from our spirituality? Are we becoming more disconnected from being in harmony with the earth? So in the film we also see this kind of personification of the jinn, right, or
Mm.
the spirits that ultimately are trying to also protect their land, right, in the sense that, like I said, in Senegal, people sometimes have to destroy baobab trees, to be able to build this new villa, build this new hotel, but there's
Right.
spirituality connected to it, right? So it's kind of like these moments where I'm personifying the jinn that live in these and that are kind of trying to protect it, like don't you dare tear us down. But then also, as we're leaving and we're forgetting about it, right, we're forgetting about the life that ultimately live within these trees, or just the life of the environment in general, right? It's something that we're turning our back on. And then we have sequences of, right, just like pollution and trash, and like how pollution is a real issue in Africa, and how it's like, how do we go from reverence to nature to like polluting, our entire environment, right? So it's kind of this kind of combination of things, and it's kind of bringing spirituality in a wider aspect that's not just about like ritual and offerings, but more so just about thinking about indigenous spiritualities and our connection to the earth, and how our
Right.
lack thereof, I think is pulling us away from that. So yeah, I think it's interesting, as I am an Afrofuturist or a futurist, and I create worlds or alternate realities in my work, I've become a lot more like an environmentalist, right? Because it's like, how can
Mm.
I be creating alternate worlds and not be thinking about taking the earth and the damage that's happening to earth in a serious way? Like, how can I not, as a traveler, pay attention to global warming when I see it being affected in every single place that I'm going to, right? Like, Japan, I feel like it's still super, like, winter isn't here at all yet, right? I think it's like people are saying it's like a month later, something like that, where like the season's supposed to change. Like, this is kind of happening, in so many different places. And it also is partially because of our own doings, right? So, um,
Sure.
I think so yeah, I think that this is kind of uh uh it's something I came into. It's interesting. I think growing up in an urban environment, you're not, you don't necessarily expect me to be like, climate change. But I think that, I think that as I've, right, not only had to think about building out, brighter futures for people of color, I also had to think about what does that brighter future for the environment look like? And how do I have a different perspective, right? Like, what is my fifth dimension perspective on the world look like when I am in oneness with the environment, or I am able to see the life that's living within the environment? Do I now approach life in a different way? So
Yeah.
those are the downloads that I've had thinking about that work, beloved, about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly, pardon me, certainly a lot to unpack, particularly around the issue of environmentalism. I mean, being in the art world, and traveling and knowing that, I, me, you, we collectively, contributing to like the carbon in the air, and then trying to think about like how to do less of that, but at the same time be able to, you know, do interesting projects in different places and bring your creativity out to the world is something I spend quite a lot of time not just thinking about but trying to like plan in different ways, to be less destructive and more constructive, for lack of a better way to put it. um, yeah, let's advance to the next image.
Cool. So this series is called Moved by Spirit. This was the part of the work that I made when I was in Black Rock, Senegal. And this image actually got collected by JP Morgan, part of their art collection.
Fantastic.
So super happy about that. But this for this work, I was thinking about again, kind of the duality of the Senegalese spirituality, and when I'm in Senegal, I was like, are they Senegalese before their Islam? Are they Islam before Senegalese? And that you realize that, and when I say that, it's like, you know, it's a 95% or 98% Islamic country, but there's things about Senegalese culture that 100% are spirituality, but they just name it as like, oh no, that's just Senegalese culture, because they don't want it to ultimately come in conflict with their, being so devout, obviously, to Allah and their Islamic practice. So it's kind of this very fine balance that I think that kind of makes a very interesting society, and also very kind of religiously open-minded, society. They're super open-minded to the Christians that they have there, although it's a small population. So for this
Right.
piece of work, Moved by Spirit, I wanted to think about, I shot this in Dakar, and a lot of the spirituality is also connected to the geographic location. So in Dakar, obviously, we have a lot of fishermen, right, that are Muslim, but you'll see them pour offerings into the ocean. You'll see them, washing their body and cleansing themselves, before praying, right? That there's this kind of whole ritual that Senegalese go through before kind of elevating to the highest consciousness to be able to speak to God.
Mm.
And this piece, right, is like a fisherman's net, right? Like kind of like a fisherman's net that I've placed on this person's head, right, to communicate this kind of geographic location, this texture between, right, the just like the what they do, the practice, right? If it's a fisherman, this is ultimately a fisherman depicting in this spiritual journey, but also, again, this I wanted this kind of this headpiece to also represent this kind of, not a black hole, but this kind of this elevation of consciousness, right? That Senegalese go through to be able to speak to God. So obviously the glasses are kind of looking towards the future. So I wanted this piece of work to kind of, yeah, I think it's a representation of many things. It's a homage to the way that the environment influences spirituality. It's a homage to this spiritual depth, and just how deep I think Senegalese go to be able to be clean, to be able to, be able to, and obviously in Islam you have to be clean to be able to pray to God. But just the depth that I think that they go to be able to reach their highest consciousness, and I think that's one of the things that I think is most memorable and just like fascinating about Senegalese. It's like people are always praying, and the praying is like in connection to the sun and how the sun is moving, and it's just it's not only it has a cosmic aspect to the way that they're also not to bring my cosmic philosophy into it, but there's like a cosmic aspect, right, where it's like clockwork, right? The sun lowers at a specific angle. The Senegalese already know it's time to pray, right? And how this is kind of just part of the natural ecosystem and environment. So that's what this piece of work. And if we move to the next piece, I think it's
Yeah.
a so this is a video sculpture I made under the same concept, Moved by Spirit. And like I was kind of saying earlier about my goal with the Mind of Its Own series, my approach is typically to, make work in many forms, right? So I'll always make a video installation. I'll have some photography. I'll have these different elements that kind of approach the storytelling in a different way. And what's cool about the video installation, it widens out what I'm talking about. So right, you see the sun, you see these different nuances of cleansing, right? Kids pouring water on each other before it's time to pray. You see people praying at the beach, but then you also have these moments where the sabar, right, which is like high energy. It's drums. It's it's channeling an ancestral energy. But obviously, at the end of the day, that energy sometimes is kind of parallel, or not. It's not it just feels opposite sometimes to the stillness and like very mindful stoic energy of when they're in their Islamic energy. So kind of wanting to have these this piece of work that showcased dualities. On one side, it was kind of showcasing these elements that are inherently Senegalese and African and cultural, but then also these other parts that are Islamic, and how this kind of all coincides together. And one of the last, I think the last image in this video installation is um, a guy wearing a jalapa, which is an all white Islamic garb,
Mm-hmm.
and a guy who's wearing an African mask, right? And they're kind of looking at each other, and that's just to be the balance, right? Like, we're both of these things, we embrace both of these things, and that's it. So it was cool to make the piece. Senegalese actually, I think the hardest part about making work as someone who, yes, I am African, but I'm not Senegalese, or I'm traveling to these spaces, right? That I still
Right.
have to, I still want the people, right, of the culture to be like, you did a good job representing us. I want them to still be proud, obviously, that I'm depicting them the right way, but also hopefully still challenging them, right? Like, I'm still challenging the way that, or being able to have them think about my perspective. And again,
Right. And
never
it's
am I
important to bring
working.
your pardon me. It's important to bring your own perspective as well, because I think to some extent you don't necessarily just want your work to be only a reflection of like what you've seen, and just like, you can point your camera and just record something and then play that back, for lack of a better way to put it. But you also want to add your own perspective, and what you see and how you see it is going to be different than what I would see and how I interpret it. So yeah, it's a balancing act, I'm sure. And then you have the audience is often the people that you're depicting in your work, so that adds another level of the challenge, because then they can see what's authentic or what's inauthentic, and sort of, yeah. But I think that makes the work even better. It puts the work through a different kind of test, so to speak, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Because you could go, for example, you could be on one of your trips, and you could record something and make a wonderful video, then bring it into sort of like a white cube gallery somewhere in the US, and show it to an audience that's never been to where you've gone to, and they'll just say, oh, that's lovely, that's beautiful, without any context.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's why it's always great, I think, for me when I'm making the work, is like, how can I, even if I'm having to go a little bit outside of, planning an event or doing something that allows the kind of culture to be able to see the work. I think it's so important, right? That, like, again, it's like, I want them to be able to be proud of their representation, but also still challenged to be able to see them, or just challenged to be able to see another perspective or another part, right? And I'm making this Gold of a Mind of its own series. Obviously, people in Cote d'Ivoire are like, do you got to bring up slavery and how that was part of the, they're probably not going to like that part, right? But that's the reality right there. That's an uncomfortable part of history that we might not want to talk about, right? The elephant in the room, but it's still part of my experience that they might not want to think about that much, but it's in the work, right? So that's kind of what I mean of, like, still adding my perspective of history, right? Because but still, obviously, like you said, it's a test to still make sure that, as a person who seeks to empower people through the work, I still want people to ultimately leave the work feeling, empowered or inspired, or grateful to have, been depicted, or grateful for me to have, done my due diligence and research, right? And being able to hopefully portray them authentically. So it definitely
Yeah.
feels good at that.
So I think that was the last image, and I think we have time for a couple more questions before we conclude today. So my first question, talk a little bit about the experience of being at Black Rock Senegal residency. I'm sure people are curious about that, and like when were you there? What was it like? That kind of
Yeah.
back would be great. Yeah.
For sure. I think I was there in like 2021. I actually got accepted the first class, but then the pandemic completely, like, messed me up. The program director was like, "Do you want to come now?" I'm like, I can't do that. So I'm happy that they were able to, honor my acceptance and kind of push me to the second class, because I would have been really disappointed if I couldn't have had this experience. But it was great. I mean, I think for me, it was my first time coming from a traditional kind of film world where I was making narrative films, and they were experimental because they were sci-fi and genre bending, but it was still much more in the narrative world. That it was kind of my first moment where I was like, I'm I'm trying to expand into the being a visual artist, right? And I think that this is the opportunity to do so. So it's honestly, I think a lot of deprogramming of how I would approach my narrative approach, and having to think about, what my voice looked like within this realm, and kind of trying to lose the rules that I had originally and how I'd go about things, and kind of, but also, right, there's a DIY aspect of independent filmmaking at times that I am still taking, right? So I am still making the costumes and creative directing for my experimental, fine art world that, is able to lend itself to that side. But it really was a deprogramming in moments where, there's times where I'm like, is this enough? Right? I could have been sitting on gold, right? This installation that we just saw is going to actually be at the LACMA in December, which is like my first video installation. But at the time, and I'm in the residency, right? I'm around all these other super serious artists, right? The painters whose process is completely different than mine, right? Because I need to be outside creating, and they're 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., right? In the studio. And I'm like needing to be outside and needing to be with the people and, chilling and getting to know them, right? It's completely different process. I think it really just pushed me to believe in myself, and kind of change the trajectory of my approach to filmmaking, and to feel that I could play a little bit more in the work, and really I think just pushing the way that I think people would experience the medium of film. I would go to museums often. I would see video installations or film installations, and it'd be something that I would stop by for 2 seconds, but never was something that really grabbed me, or like allowed me to really want to watch the whole entire thing. And I came into it being like, I want to do something different. I want to create these immersive experiences that like really draw people in, and like, have the capacity that it's about whether or not it's you watch the whole thing or not. Like you leave with this certain energy or this certain frequency or this certain kind of light bulb moment in watching the work. So it was a great experience. The staff and the team at Burning Man. I mean, I'm not Burning Man, at Black Rock Senegal were super supportive. I think they take you around the country and they really think about what your application is and how that can really how they can support you in diving deeper into your research. So it was an amazing program, and I'm happy to be part of the Black Rock family and to have connected with so many amazing artists now, who are part of that ecosystem. I was just with one of like a Black Rock artist in Tokyo, right? Like now every country I go to, right? Like I have like a Black Rock artist that I can like hit up, and it's like community, So I'm grateful to be alumni and part of the community.
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful note. Wonderful note to end on. Is there anything you're looking forward to? Like this will be the final question. Like, what are you looking forward to? Is there a project? Is there something you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a couple of different shows coming up at the end of this year, but I'm definitely excited for my LACMA this LACMA show that I'm in. Imagining Black Diasporas, that's opening in December. It's part of a group show of 60 amazing artists, but I think it's cool. It's always a beautiful feeling when you have work. It's been a while, right? My work has been in Senegal, within West Africa, but it's gonna be my first time kind of bringing it over, this project, Moved by Spirit, over to America. So I'm excited. I'm excited to bring the work into a new stratosphere and environment, and for people to connect to it towards the end of the year. So lots of things. But yeah.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. You've been a wonderful guest, so I'll wave my goodbye. So the Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. You can lend your support to the Gantt Center by texting GIVE to Gantt, that's GIVE, the number 2, Gantt, to the number 91999. Also be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for future programs and other content updates. We want to thank you for joining us today for this Open Air conversation, and we look forward to next month's Open Air with artist Nona Faustine. Have a wonderful evening, and everyone stay safe.